Thank you very much, Richard. I'm delighted to be here and to introduce the two speakers for this session. And I will introduce them separately. So I will begin with Dana Sajdi, whom I'm delighted to say is our new colleague. She is in her second year in the history department at Boston College, where she teaches Islamic history. Before coming to BC, she studied as an undergraduate at the American University in Cairo, where she did a degree in sociology and theater. She received her PhD from Columbia in Middle Eastern and Asian languages and culture. And then she also had a number of very prestigious fellowships, including a postdoctoral fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, and a fellowship or visiting research associate position at the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. She is the author of, among other things, of an edited volume entitled, I love the title, Ottoman Tulips, Ottoman Coffee, Leisure and Lifestyles in the 18th Century. She is currently working on a monograph entitled, another great title, I have to say, The Barber of Damascus, Nouveau Literacy in the Early Modern Middle East. I welcome Dana Sajdi.
Thank you, Rida, and thank you, Professor Carney, for insisting on inviting me. I have to say that I'm an expert neither in hospitality nor the Islamic tradition as such. And I said to Professor Carney when he first invited me by email, I said, between you and me, this is going to be like discussing God and the meaning of life in a Parisian cafe. And he said, that's exactly what I want you to do. And so, unfortunately, we're not in a Parisian cafe, unfortunately. I'm not going to discuss God, but I want to discuss life and perhaps death. The other thing is that I'm a historian. I'm not an expert, I'm not a philosopher nor an expert in theology. Which means that, and I didn't want to wear hats that were not my own. And so what I'm trying to do here is habilitate myself, what I do, into your space, and invite you to please kind of share with me in this disciplinary exchange. So it's an interdisciplinary thing. So what I'm going to say is very circumscribed to period and time and space. It's not about the Islamic tradition through key texts. Actually, that's the whole point, which is to, kind of to question the Islamic tradition as such. So it's about the cracks within the Islamic tradition in a specific moment in time. And and it's kind of an aimless talk. It doesn't have really a thesis, and I'm glad none of my students are here because I always say thesis. So I'm going to take you around and around the cities of Damascus and Aleppo in Syria, which are the cities that I work on most. The other point is that I'm not doing interreligious stuff because it's not because I refuse to, it's just my sources don't allow me to do that. And since I didn't want to wear another hat, I'm using my own sources, what I work on, for this presentation. And I will be writing on the board names and things so that you will remember them because I get back to them and maybe the Arabic may be too difficult for you to remember. But as I was now in break 5 minutes ago, I'm reading my book for my seminar on Monday for my students. And the first, the introduction, the quote at the beginning of the introduction actually is relevant, it seems. It's by Brodel, the historian Brodel, which says, every town is and wants to be a world apart. All or nearly all of them between the 15th century and 18th centuries, or 15th and 18th centuries, had ramparts. And so I'm going to be talking about cities to start with. And so it's about the city and if it is inclusive or exclusive. So let me start with two quotations. One is by someone called Nabulusi, or Nabulusi. He died in 1731. He is a Damascene, despite the sobriquet Nablisi, which means he's from Nablus, the city in the West Bank. So his grandfather was from that town, but he was a true Damascene. He was born there. He was a natural leader of the community, if you will. And he's one of the most important scholars and mystics in the 18th century in the entire Islamic world. So I'm talking about a really, really big figure. And he famously wrote of himself, I am a Shami. Sham means both Damascus and the entire Levant. So it's kind of the geography here is very interesting. So I'm a Shami. He does not say I'm a Damashqi, which means Damascene. So it means both. He says, I'm a Shami. I am an Indian. I am a Rumi. Rumi means both. So it's actually Roman, Eastern Roman Empire, which is Byzantium, which means, the parts of the Ottoman Empire that were Byzantium originally, and also Istanbul. So it's huge, many significations to this. So he says, I am Shami, I am Rumi, I am Indian, I am Sicilian. And so this kind of different, different identification in the self is something that I want you to remember. And it's all coming from geographical regions in the world. So it takes over the Mediterranean into South Asia. Another person that I'm going to talk a lot about today is Ibn Kannan, another Damascene, another person from Damascus. He died in 1740. He was also a scholar and a mystic, but certainly not of the intellect of Nabulsi. He was kind of a famous guy in town, but his reputation didn't go out of his city. But what is great about Ibn Kannan is he left us a wonderful chronicle about the events in his city, and it's a window into the life of the city for that period. And he was an associate of Nabulsi, but he talks about him respectfully, but they're not best friends. So what is great about Ibn Kannan is that it's a source that is very important to us about the life of the city in that period. So at a certain point, he's talking about events and people, and at a certain point he says, he talks about the arrival of a community of immigrants, 400 of them, from the city of Balkh in today's Afghanistan. Ibn Kannan, being a notable of the town, waited for the community to settle in and went over to welcome them through a meeting with their leader. After the meeting, he reports, whatever the community earns is giving to their ustad. Ustad is like mentor, master, leader. So it's giving to their ustad. This is not dispensed to them even as inheritance. They call his wife the lady, and they are like servants to her and walk with her in retinue. Their obedience to their mentor is not equal by that accorded to the great ruler. No one is seated in the assembly of the master except his deputy or the leader to prayers, the imam. They have customs that do not make sense to the people of this land. They have customs that do not make sense to the people of this land. Keep these two anecdotes in mind. What Nabulsi said about himself and what Ibn Kannan talked about, what he said about this immigrant community. According to the dictionary on my Oxford American Dictionary on my Mac computer, the definition of hospitality is the friendly or generous reception and entertainment of visitors, guests, or strangers. It is the element of stranger that I'm interested in here, as in the Arabic literary tradition, actually in culture, if you will, as opposed to the religious tradition. And here, I don't want to, just because I don't know about the religious tradition, but I don't know where this ideal comes from. The ideal is that hospitality should be directed at the stranger. Allowing your sister to partake in your life and property is not hospitality at all, as your sister is you. She is family. She is familiar. In this presentation, I look at hospitality as a process of rendering the stranger familiar through an act of sharing and/or of reception. Thus, this paper is about the stranger versus the familiar. And here, the familiar, I mean both familiar in its current sense and its in Latin sense, which is family, household. So in Arabic, you say, and actually it's not only today, I've seen it in medieval kind of sources, you say, the house is yours. You don't say my house is yours or this house is yours. It's the house, which means, going back to yesterday's talk about Derrida, the immediate dispossession of yourself, of the house, is immediate, even till today. So the idea is you have to give away your house to the other immediately. So I don't know where that ideal come from, and I don't want to discuss the sources of that, but it exists now and it existed then. So to return to Ibn Kannan, the second guy with the chronicle, and his encounter with the Balkhi community. In this encounter, we have a moment when one Muslim community enters the space, and a beloved space at that. People love their cities, I don't know why. Enter the space of another. Ibn Kannan, as a prominent member of the community, enacts this ideal. The ideal that I mentioned, he receives the strangers. But despite the assumed familiarity and shared vocabulary derived from the fact of an all-encompassing Islamic tradition, Ibn Kannan is estranged by the behavior of the Balkhis. Thus, a moment of estrangement is born out of an attempt at familiarizing. In this rather aimless talk, it is this tension between inclusion and exclusion of strangers into the life of the cities of Syria that I would like to explore. So I'm not talking about the sublime. Here we're talking about social practice. My query comes out of my own estrangement, if you will, when I came across topographical references in my sources to the graveyard of the strangers. And these graveyard of the strangers appeared, they're topographical areas in both Damascus and Aleppo. My question is regarding the discursive contradiction of this topographical feature. As soon as one identifies the stranger is made immediately familiar. What was the use of this so-called graveyard of the strangers? To peripheralize, to keep out, to exclude? But these graveyards are, by definition, included in the urban topography. So it's that contradiction that I'm interested in. Because my next project is about literary urban topographies, I'm especially interested in the relationships and interactions between the social space, the textual space, and the urban space. In a very long-winded fashion, I will take you between these three spaces in the cities of Damascus and Aleppo. This is to demonstrate a proposition, not to demonstrate a proposition as I have none, but in a story about, it's an attempt to solve the mystery of the graveyard of the strangers. My protagonists, perforce, are the scholars of religion, some of whom are mystics, such as An-Nabulsi and Ibn Kannan that I mentioned. They are my protagonists simply because they happen to be the main authors of texts. But this fact in itself is telling. They have the discursive hegemony. And so who are these scholars of religion? In Arabic, we call them the ulama. And I'm sure some of you, if you have studied any Islamic history, you would have heard of that social group, the ulama. A short definition of the ulama would be clergy, but clergy is both inaccurate translation, is an inaccurate translation because they are much more and perhaps much less than Christian clergy. They are transmitters and producers of knowledge, whether religious, historical, and even literary. They are interpreters of divine law, and as such, they were dubbed the heirs of the Prophet in a formula attributed to the Prophet himself. In other words, this social group commanded moral and social authority. And in their occupation of administrative and judicial office positions, they, or some of them, also constituted a political elite. They are multi-competent, literate part of the population who functioned as a crucial link between state and society. This formulation of state and society is now démodé, right? But that was one of the biggest studies on them, kind of posited them at that, and for the time being, it's useful. And given that they're hinges, or the connection between state and the society, because they actually occupied positions in both. So this is to say we cannot imagine an Islamic society without the scholars at all. We cannot imagine Islamic society without them, not only because of their discursive hegemony, of their knowledge, they're the natural organic leaders of the community. So we can't imagine Islamic society without them. But also, I don't want you to think of them as an isolated part of the community. You can find them at every socioeconomic level. However, the elites among them, those who were prominent for whatever reason, were the civilian elite of the city in general. So what do the scholars and their texts have to do with hospitality? As in the anecdote of the encounter with the Balkhi community, it was the scholars or the notables amongst them who were endowed with the authority to decide to whom to open the door, who to allow to partake, in other words, whom to integrate into the community. And this is not in reference to any religious dictum or proposition. I'm just saying this was the practice. How did these scholars, being the natural leaders of the community, integrate, that is include, or estrange, that is exclude, in their textual, social, and actual practices? The simple answer is by the establishment of social hierarchies of place and situation. But this happened in a very, very complicated fashion. Let us look at the following, or listen to the following entry in the same chronicle by Ibn Kannan in describing the inaugural lecture of the teaching cycle in one of the colleges of Damascus. So they went in ceremonial fashion to attend the inauguration of a teaching cycle of some famous scholar. So he says, on Thursday, our master, Muhammad Effendi al-Imadi, started the teaching cycle at the Sulaymaniya College. The lesson was attended by the notables. On Imadi's right sat al-Sheikh al-Muradi. Then al-Sheikh whatever. He's the jurisconsult of Damascus. Then our master, the scholar al-Sheikh Muhammad Effendi al-Hanafi. On his, that is the lecturer, on his left sat Maulana such and such, and he is the Hanafi jurisconsult of Damascus. And directly next to him sat such and such, who is the teacher at the Zahiriya College. Then his cousin, such and such, the teacher of the Balkhiya College. As for the Shafi'i jurisconsult, Maulana such and such, he sat in the line behind the revered teacher. And as for Sheikh Mullah Ilyas, he sat in the line of the students because it was in his habit to detest fame and haughtiness. So remember this Mullah Ilyas, remember that he leaves this scholarly circle to sit with the students. The savants, teachers, jurisconsults, and judges are meticulously organized in a neat hierarchy where each one is assigned a seating position commensurate to his social position. In other words, these scholars define themselves in relation to one another in a familiar and familiarizing vocabulary of a closed seating arrangement. It is noteworthy that this seating arrangement takes place in a college, and indeed, some of the illustrious savants are associated with known urban institutions, especially the colleges mentioned in the quote that I gave you. Each of which is a physical landmark. Thus, this seating arrangement is not only a microcosm and a reduction to the essence of the scholar's social world, but also, in as much as the scholars are associated with institutions, the arrangements inscribe the scholars in the urban topography. But what is most remarkable about this passage is the action of Mullah Ilyas, a famous scholar and mystic. His act of abandoning the scholarly circle and joining the row of, what is important is the abandoning of the scholarly circle and joining the row of the students. This act and its immediate comprehension and interpretation by the author, Ibn Kannan, helps us to decode the social vocabulary of the seating arrangement. So Ibn Kannan immediately read his act as an act against fame and haughtiness. So he gave an interpretation to it immediately. Mullah Ilyas's abandonment is meant as an expression of humility, an act to counter fame. It is to unfame. In other words, to render himself unfamiliar, unknown to the community of scholars. Of course, this is mere pretense. He leaves the hierarchy because he has no use for it any longer. He is above and beyond the hierarchies and relative definition because he's way too famous. So he now does not have to sit with them. So he's a league of his own, so to speak. However, let us keep in mind Mullah Ilyas's attempt, as pretentious as it is, but his attempt to defamiliarize or estrange himself, which could be seen, if you will, as a rejection of hospitality or a refusal to partake. Let us move from the realm of actual social practice to look at the text as a parallel practice. If the definition of the scholar is the one who specializes in God or things divine, his social definition comes in his tireless practice of writing about himself to himself, or the group. They're always writing things about themselves to the group. That is to inscribe themselves in text. While the Chronicle of Ibn Kannan devotes copious, though not exclusive, attention to the scholars, the genre of the biographical dictionary is the main discursive expression of and the means to the perpetuation of the scholars as a species, so to speak. The biographical dictionary is a sort of who's who, made up of obituaries and necrologies. So it's one of the most prolific genres in Islamic history. These, compendiums of obituaries. And, the scholars are the main inhabitants of this genre. There were other people who were written about, but the scholars are the main subjects of this. And it's written by scholars, obviously. A typical entry would include a scholar's academic achievements, what they studied, who they studied with, where they taught, who were their students, what their colleagues thought of them, and where they were. Where they studied, so the places are as important as the people, and where they were buried is the last thing that the obituary would give you. Note again that the obituary too inscribed the scholars in the urban topography by mentioning the institutions with which this scholar was associated, including the colleges, where he studies and where he studied and where he taught. If relevant, they would mention the Dervish lodge or the Sufi lodge where they stayed, and the mosque in which the prayer of the deceased was said before his burial. So we mention the mosque where after he died, people performed the prayer of the deceased on him. The mosque is mentioned. So the spatial aspect of these obituaries is really huge. However, the point of mentioning the biographical dictionary as a genre is that even more than in the meaning of the seating arrangement described above, taken together, the biographical dictionary maps out the social world of the scholars, their teachers, their disciples, and associates, and defines them in hierarchies that establish their relative positions in that world. It is a textual practice that establishes them as a community within the urban topography and identifies each within that community. But we have to be aware that biographical dictionaries sometimes are related to a particular town, but sometimes are, huge they mention the entire century. So the biographical dictionary does not have to be associated always with a particular town. But the scholar's strategies of identifying or rendering familiar are not limited to seating arrangements in life or inclusion in textual space, but also extends to the subterranean world. That world too has social signification. The dead too have a definite address. I have just mentioned that obituaries indicate place of burial. Let us look at a few short entries in Ibn Kannan's chronicle. He says, on the 23rd of Muharram 1124, this is the Hijri, the Islamic calendar, which happens to be 1712, Sayyid Fadl whatever al-Fustuqi died in Damascus. The prayer of the deceased was held in the Umayyad mosque. And by the way, the Umayyad mosque, which is the main congregational mosque till today, from the moment of the entry of the Muslims into Syria, was the church of John the Baptist. So, and the Byzantine mosaic still exists today in it. So, the prayer of the deceased was held in the Umayyad mosque. He was buried in Mount Qasyun by the grave of Al-Qumaini, across from the grave of the Saint Muhammad al-Sayyah, to the west of his Zainabiyya and Rukayniyya colleges. Just a note of explanation that Al-Qumaini and the two, and al-Sayyah, next to whom Al-Fustuqi was buried, are saints. And note that the location of his grave is also associated with the colleges. So again, there's a very clear marking. Another entry. The excellent Sheikh Ibrahim Effendi, the sermonist of Al-Salimiyya College in the suburb of Al-Salihiyya, died. The prayer of the deceased was performed in Al-Ward Mosque, and he was buried in Bab al-Saghir near Uwais. Uwais happens to be a companion of the Prophet, so he has saintly value. Okay? So he's one of the earliest Muslims. And yet another, As-Sayyid Al-Yazbaki al-Naqshbandi. Al-Yazbaki, I have to say, is one of the members of the Balkhi community who had moved to Damascus. Died of the epidemic, here he means the plague, in his house in the west of Al-Ward Mosque. The prayer of the deceased was performed at the mosque, and he was buried in Mount Qasyun in the burying plot of the commoners, outside the plot of his sheikh, or his mentor. No one is buried within that plot except for the sheikh, his mentor, and the tailor, Ishaq. Everyone else is buried outside and around that plot. I mean, look at the specification and characterization of this burial spot. So in the neighborhood of the dead, there is social hierarchy. To be buried in the public burying plot in Mount Qasyun, as in the case of the Balkhi, is markedly different in status from being buried in a private plot. And I didn't give you an example, but there are examples of those who are buried in private plots. Or being surrounded by illustrious neighbors, such as the companion Uwais, or in the case of Ibrahim Effendi, or by the famous mystics. So what I'm wondering is that the Balkhi, who was a recent immigrant to Damascus, is the fact that he's an immigrant that was responsible for his failure to acquire a more prestigious burial spot. So the fact that he's a foreigner, that's what I'm wondering. If that, kind of led to his being buried in the commoners' burying spot. The social significance of Al-Yazbaki's burial in the public plot is revealed when one compares his funerary address with that of an Indian immigrant. I will skip his name. The pious and cultivated saint such and such came to Damascus in 1094, this is the Islamic calendar, and lodged in Al-Qishani hospice to the east of the Umayyad mosque, along with his cousin such and such. He was a virtuous, devout, quiet, upright, and unswerving man. He is the author of a book. He mentions the title. He was ill with dropsy and swelling for a year. The prayer of the deceased was said over him at the midday prayers in the Umayyad mosque. He was buried in the eastern graveyard on the side of the strangers. Badruddin this Indian guy, is an immigrant who, despite residing in Damascus for 40 years and despite all his obvious social standing, remained unassimilated even in death and was buried in the plot set aside for strangers. This Yazbaki from Balkh, at least, seems to have, the other one, the one who came from Balkh, seems to at least have assimilated sufficiently into Damascene society as to be buried as a Damascene, although in the commoner's plot. So what is this about? Is it that the immigrants, despite being Muslim scholars and mystics, and are famous ones at that, are kept on the peripheries of these dense and complex hierarchies, limited to the graveyards of the strangers? Are the gestures of hospitality shown by Ibn Kannan to the new Balkhi community on their arrival merely a nod to the ideal of hospitality to strangers? Are the words of a Nabilsi, I am a Damascene, I am an Istanbulite, I'm a Sicilian, I'm an Indian, are these hollow words? Is it that the Damascene scholars were never able to familiarize the strangers, to incorporate them into the self? What is this graveyard of the strangers? And this is kind of what I'm trying to resolve here. I do not have an answer to tell you in advance, but a clue may lie in the action of Mullah Ilyas, this one, who left the scholarly circle, the one who abandoned the circle of the scholars to join the students. Could scholars and mystics have chosen to leave the hierarchies of the dead, that is, before they were dead, because they were actually too famous to play the musical chairs in the subterranean seating arrangement? A recent study by Hegnar Wattenpa is suggestive. So let us now move from Damascus in the 18th century to Aleppo in the 16th century, and the life of not just a mystic, he's an antinomian mystic. And his name is Abu Bakr, just for you to remember. Abu Bakr stunned the city of Aleppo with his strange habits. He was an antinomian mystic who displays the most extreme of antisocial practices accustomed from the category of mystic known as the possessed. This trend of deviant possessed mystics appears as a distinct social movement, if you will, in the late 13th century in Central Asia and the Middle East, and continued well beyond the 18th century. Here is Wattenpa's description of them. Having rejected settled life, and actually the early ones of them, the 13th century, came from very good established families, so it was kind of an anarchist move, if you will. They roamed the countryside and violated the space of the city to flaunt their outrageous behavior. This included an eccentric appearance in society where self-presentation functioned as a marker of identity. They inverted social hierarchies and disregarded Islamic law. They consumed alcohol, they did all the prohibited things, basically. This Abu Bakr, among other things, lived in the ruined places as well as in the extramural spaces such as the graveyard of the strangers. Wattenpa argues that the connection with the cemeteries was a realization of a prophetic injunction, quote, die before you die. This is by Sufis taken as a very important dictum because it's about a union with God before you actually die. So die into God before you die. Where the mystic behaved like, and so in his case, he wanted to behave as a cadaver, which included dwelling in graveyards. So he died before he died. He lived in the cemetery. I mean, that's Wattenpa's interpretation. Abu Bakr lived and died in the graveyard, of course, as a saint. I mean, his behavior to start with was that of, I mean, sainthood in Islam is very different from Christianity in the sense that there's no official ceremony for it. I mean, a saint becomes a saint in their own lifetime by kind of performing miracles or kind of making people believe that you are special somehow. So they're blessed and they emanate blessing, if you will. So he lived a saint and died a saint. His grave became a site of veneration and with time acquired a monumental mausoleum attached to a lodge for mystics. So it became this huge landmark. Wattenpa thus shows how the construction of this huge edifice ushered the transformation of the wilderness, that is the graveyard, into civilization or urbanity, that is the city. In other words, regardless, or perhaps because of Abu Bakr's strangeness, that is his unassimilability, and refusing to be familiar, not only was he accepted into the topography, but the entire city extended its borders to include him, albeit after his death. So that whole extramural part of Aleppo became internal to Aleppo because of his grave, basically. So to conclude, let me offer a few premises that may or may not lead to a valid syllogism. Is that how you pronounce it? Number one, Mullah Ilyas was too famous to remain in the circle of scholars. He decided to sit among the students or the commoners. Two, the Indian mystic, well known for his scholarship, but most especially for his mystic piety, was buried in the graveyard of the strangers. Three, the Balkhi, who comes from a community whose manners are strange to these lands, was buried next to his master in the graveyard of the commoners. However, there is a qualification about his tomb. The plot included only him, his mentor, and a tailor. No one else was buried in the plot around them. So this qualification is a bit strange. 4. Abu Bakr, the strange dervish saint, lived and died in the graveyard of the strangers, effectively causing wilderness to turn into civilization. Were the Balkhis acting in the manner of Mullah Ilyas, too famous to deign to join the hierarchy? Was the Indian mystic a tamer version of Abu Bakr, the antinomian? Is the graveyard of the strangers really the graveyard of the blessed? Is it actually at the heart of urbanity and hence religious life? I do not know, but I know that we may have here a vocabulary for research that includes both the living and the dead as they interact in their capacity as natives and strangers to partake in the city, to make the city, sometimes in an ironic and strange way, hospitable to them. And I also know that these strangers, the Balkhis and the Indians, despite their seemingly being on the margin, were by definition rendered familiar because they actually entered textual space. I mean, they entered Ibn Kannan's chronicle. That in itself is a kind of a welcoming into textual space, into your own space. Interestingly, this happened only upon their death, when they were interred into the subterranean topography of Damascus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. We now welcome our second speaker, Joseph Lumbard, who is Assistant Professor of Classical Islam at Brandeis University, where he focuses on Islamic intellectual traditions and specifically Sufism and Islamic philosophy. Joseph Lumbard received his PhD from Yale University in Islamic Studies after completing his BA at George Washington University, as well as and his master's in religious studies from George Washington University. He is a scholar who has, who is working on a number of projects. He is among some of the research that I'd like to mention here. He is the editor of Islam, Fundamentalism, and the Betrayal of Tradition, a collection of essays that examines the factors that led to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, and which contains his contribution entitled "The Decline of Knowledge and the Rise of Ideology in a Modern Islamic World." He is also the editor of Study Quran for HarperCollins, and he before teaching at Brandeis, he was assistant professor of Islamic Studies at American University in Cairo. And he also served as special advisor to the King of Jordan. So we're very happy to welcome you here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for inviting me to be at Boston College. There's something I really like about talking at Boston College. I can't quite put my finger on it. I also want to apologize to all of the other speakers before I begin, because some other obligations don't allow me to spend as much time as I would like at other people's talks, namely my children and my wife all have the flu, so I escaped for a little while and I have to go back. Now, I want to also thank you for asking me to talk about this topic, as it's something that I thought hospitality in Islam, well, I guess I could look at it, and then when I dug more deeply into it, I found that really nobody's actually written a very good article about it anywhere. There's not really any good encyclopedia articles about it. And it's something that if you look deeply into the sources, you can tease out some very interesting attitudes towards hospitality, and particularly towards the spiritual virtues that hospitality entails. And though Donna may not be aware of it, she actually alluded to it in some of the things that she was speaking of. First of all, the famous saying, the house is your house, this immediate dispossession of the house. And also in this famous saying, die before you die. Now, as I go on, we'll see how these are reflected in the Islamic attitude towards hospitality. Now, when I first lived in Morocco in the summer of either I think it might have been 1992, I can't remember exactly now, I was overwhelmed by the hospitality that I often received. I first set foot in Tangiers, which is not very hospitable unless you are inclined to tourist traps. But I soon traveled to Chefchaouen, Tetuan, and various other places before I settled down and resided in Fez for several months. In each place, I was welcomed into the homes of people whom I had never met, with an openness and hospitality that often far exceeded that which I have experienced in the homes of people that I've known for many years in the United States. Now, of the memories that I have from this, which was my first adventure into the Muslim world, there is one that is most dear to me. One evening, between the sunset and evening prayers, I was sitting in the courtyard of the famous Qarawin Mosque in the center of the old city of Fez. I was scheduled to leave the country in just 2 or 3 days and was enjoying this last opportunity to soak up the ambience and the barakah of this, which is for me really a magical place. And the word barakah means like the grace or blessing of God. Now, as I was sitting there, an old man, you should know in Morocco, since they get a lot of tourists, oftentimes when a white Muslim, such as myself, is sitting in the mosque or entering in the mosque, you are accosted. And you have to go through the Muslim security check. But so I'm sitting there in the mosque, and this very old man in worn, dirty clothes, he comes up to me and looks me up and down. And he's carrying a bucket of water to give to people. And he looks at me very sternly. He says, "Muslim?" And I answered in the affirmative. And then he says, "Abuka Muslim? Is your father Muslim?" I said, "No." He says, "Ummuka Muslim? Is your mother Muslim?" And I said, "No." At this moment, his face transformed from that of the stern inquisitioner who had first approached me to a childlike joy. And he began to weep. And he got down on his knees and he hugged me. Then he stood back up, and with what looked like great difficulty, and to my horror, he grabbed the bucket of water that he had, and he scooped that cup in there, and he handed it to me, and he said, "Bismillah," in the name of God. Now, this water was not clean. But I sat there, and I looked, and I said, "Okay, well, Bismillah, in the name of God, I've got to accept this." I really did feel like I had a choice. And indeed, unfortunately, the generosity and the hospitality of this old man came back with me to the United States in the form of an intestinal souvenir. Now, I got Giardia. I was quite ill for about a month. Nonetheless, this is really, it's still, and I think if I hadn't gotten Giardia, the memory wouldn't be so wonderful for me, but the joy of that man, the joy that he felt in offering hospitality to a stranger was something that that really stuck with me. And I'd seen many examples of it, but this was kind of the best example of it that I'd seen when I was there. And this is a person probably with no possessions, judging from his condition, probably a jalabiya or two to his name. And he felt like he had to give me something. And so it was that cup of water. But I also learned something through this. There's a flip side to this, and something that I had learned during my time in Morocco, which I think is also something that is often forgotten, which is that hospitality is a two-way street. Not only is there hospitality that one must have toward the family, the friend, and the stranger. Not only is this considered to be a moral imperative in much of the Islamic world, so too accepting hospitality from others, however mean their circumstances, is considered to be a moral imperative. It is a way in which we manifest mercy towards one another, and in which we help to bring the mercy of God more fully into the world. Because from a theological perspective, any act of mercy in which we partake is actually a reflection of God's mercy, or even a manifestation of that mercy. Now, in many ways, the Islamic attitude towards hospitality that this old man embodied for me derives from pre-Islamic times, for generosity and hospitality were considered to be among the chief virtues of a noble Bedouin. In fact, many verses of pre-Islamic poetry enjoin or boast of what could best be termed a reckless hospitality, wherein one sacrifices all that they own to honor the guest. One could see how in a desert environment, such an emphasis on hospitality might develop. For the serious harm of traveling in such harsh desert conditions, in such serious conditions, a single act of hospitality could be the difference between life and death. Nonetheless, Islam came and called for a moderation of what we could call here a profligate hospitality, while still emphasizing the importance of honoring the guest and of providing charity. The key difference and the key alteration that one can find within Islam is that it must be done with humility, such that the right hand, in a sense, knows not what the left hand does, and must also be done in moderation. In this way, the Quran enjoins charity and hospitality without excessive indulgence, without boasting, and without condescension. Now, from pre-Islamic times until today, one of the vilest insults in many Arab lands has been to call someone stingy, miserly, or inhospitable. In some of the famous early stories of poets throwing jabs at one another, the jabs would really be, how the real insults would start getting down to how miserly, niggardly, stingy, and inhospitable another person is. And still, some of the most famous lines of poetry in the Arab world are ones wherein two poets were going at each other, talking about how stingy one another may be. Now, being stingy, miserly, or inhospitable are also presented in the Quran as major moral flaws. The most famous instance is probably chapter 107 of the Quran, which says, "Hast thou seen the one who denies religion? That is the one who drives away the orphan and does not urge feeding the indigent. So woe unto the performers of prayer, who are heedless of their prayers, those who strive to be seen, yet refuse small kindnesses. Now, this really drives to the heart of one of the main problems that one has within religion, is those who want to appear to be religious and pious, yet when it comes to opening their hearts to those around them, they won't do that unless it will be an opportunity for others to remark upon how pious or how generous they may be. Now, the Quran also speaks repeatedly of the need to be generous and to give charity. Two of the best examples of these are verses 2:215 and 2:274. The first says, "They ask thee what they should spend. Say, let whatever of your wealth you spend be for parents, kinsmen, orphans, the indigent, and the traveler. Whatever good you do, truly God knows it." And 2:274 says, "Those who spend their wealth by night and by day, secretly and openly, shall have their reward with their Lord, and no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they sorrow." Now, providing for the poor has also become a major part of major Muslim feasts, such as the end of Ramadan and the feast of the Hajj. It's even said that when one has a marriage ceremony and the banquet of a marriage ceremony, that if one is wealthy, one must also invite the poor to partake of that. There's a famous hadith, a saying of the Prophet, which says, "The worst food is that of a banquet to which the rich are invited, but not the poor. And whosoever avoids inviting has disobeyed God and his messenger." The implication here being the inviting those who are poor as well as those who are rich. So it is really disobeying God not to share one's feast with all strata of society. Now, this generosity is undoubtedly an important part of hospitality, but it is not necessarily hospitality in and of itself. And the Quran, in fact, says very little about hospitality in a direct manner. Nonetheless, there are several verses of the Quran for which the revelation is said to have been prompted or to have been occasioned by an act of hospitality. Now, let me just fill in, since I know most people here aren't in Islamic studies, that there's a body of literature in Islam that is called the Occasions of Revelation, that is said to provide the particular historical context in which a particular verse of the Quran was revealed. The Quran, is said not to have been revealed instantly, but over this 23-year period, and that many of the verses are said to have been God responding to a particular situation that the Muslim community was confronting, extolling a particular person at some points, condemning another person at another point. Now, a famous example of this is verse 59:9. This verse states, "And those who settled in the land and within belief love those who immigrated to them, and find in their breasts no need for that which they were given, preferring others over themselves, even if they themselves be impoverished. And whosoever is shielded from the avarice of his own soul, they shall be the prosperous." Now here we need a little bit of contextualization historically, because the verse is talking about many of the Muslim community that emigrated from Mecca, the first Muslims that emigrated from Mecca, where, according to the histories, though it's somewhat debated, according to the histories, they were facing oppression, and settled then in Medina, where for the first time they were actually able to set up an entire Muslim community, and where Muhammad was then in charge of that community. But many of the people who emigrated were among the poorest members of the community in Mecca, and so they had very difficult circumstances. Now, it is said that this verse, 59:9, was revealed when Muhammad entrusted one of the people who had come from Mecca who lived right outside of the mosque, had no home and no property unto himself, but he lived right outside of the Prophet's mosque. And that Muhammad had asked a man from among the helpers, just those people who were in Medina, had asked him to look after the former, that is, to look after the other person from Mecca. So the man from Medina, the helper, took the other man to his family and asked his wife, "Do we have anything to feed him?" She said, "We do not have anything except for the children's food." He said, "Put them to sleep and then bring me the food. And when you put the food down, turn the lamp off." She did as her husband requested, and then the helper, the man from Medina, offered what he had to his guest. The following morning, he took him back to the Prophet Muhammad, who said, "Indeed, the dwellers of the heavens are amazed at what the two of you have done." And it is then, according to the Muslim histories, that this verse 59:9 was revealed. Now, two aspects for our purposes here are fundamental to this verse. The first is that of preferring others to oneself, a virtue that comes to be known in the later Islamic tradition simply as ithar. And you can see ithar simply just means preferring. And so you can see that it becomes to be known as such a central virtue that one doesn't even have to mention others. You just say ithar and everybody knows what you mean. That is preferring others to yourself. The second is that of being shielded from the avarice of one's own soul. Now, I will come back to these after mentioning a few hadith, that is, more sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, that fill the gap left by the Quran's discussion of hospitality, or lack thereof. But for now, I should mention the important implication that we have here, that by preferring others to oneself, one shields oneself against the avarice of one's soul. Now, in many sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, courtesy and hospitality are presented as central virtues associated with being a believer or being a Muslim. Perhaps the best known of these is one wherein Muhammad was asked, "What is the best part of Islam?" and responded, "Offering food and extending the greeting of peace to those you know and to those you do not know." In another oft-cited hadith, Muhammad is reported to have said, "There is no good in one who is not hospitable." And his servant, Anas bin Malik, reports, "A house which is not entered by a guest is not entered by angels." Another saying of Muhammad, considered to be well authenticated, enjoins neighborliness and hospitality upon all believers, saying, quote, "May he who believes in God and the last day do no harm to his neighbor, and may he who believes in God and the last day honor his guest, and may he who believes in God and the last day say what is good or keep silent." Now, I should say a quick note here on the issue of hadith. It's a much debated thing. Did Muhammad actually say these things, or did he not say these things? For our purposes here, it doesn't matter, because the point is that he is believed to have said them, and therefore they represent virtues that the Muslim community thought at least he would have enjoined upon the people. And others would say that they definitely are there, but again, for our purposes, it really doesn't matter. They're part of the tradition, and that's the important thing. Now, the virtues of generosity and hospitality are in fact so deeply rooted within Islam that one finds them cited as virtues that attested to Muhammad's qualification to be a messenger of God. In the story of the very first revelation, Muhammad is said to have been awestruck at receiving words from God and to have doubted his own sanity, saying, "I fear that something may happen to me." But his wife, Khadija, comforted him by replying, "Never, by God. God will never disgrace you. You keep good relations with your kith and kin. You help the poor and the destitute. You serve your guests generously, and you assist those afflicted by calamity." Now, in examining this understanding of hospitality within Islam, we need to remember again, going back to what I said at the end of that story with the old man, that it is presented as a two-way street. Not only must one open one's home, one's heart, to family, to friends, and to strangers, so too, accepting invitations is considered to be among the most important acts of generosity within Islam, and the most important attitudes towards the other. In this vein, it is reported that Muhammad would accept an invitation from a bondsman or from a pauper. And one often comes across a very famous saying of the Prophet Muhammad that said, "Were I invited to eat trotters, I would accept, and were I to be given leg of lamb, I would accept." Another famous hadith enjoins Muslims to accept invitations. Quote, "He who has not accepted an invitation has disobeyed God and his Prophet." The emphasis upon accepting invitations is so predominant within Islam that several sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad even enjoin accepting an invitation if one is doing a voluntary fast. And voluntary fasting is deeply emphasized within the Islamic tradition. However, there are several that say if you're doing a voluntary fast, supererogatory fast, and somebody invites you out of the kindness of their heart, then you should break the fast and accept. Now this again, so this wouldn't include, for example, the fast of Ramadan, which is obligatory. Now some even go so far as to say that the reward for breaking an intended supererogatory fast is double. The reward of the fast itself and the reward for having cut the fast short in order to gladden the heart of another of God's servants. Now within these sayings, we see not only a teaching about the importance of hospitality and generosity, but about the respect that one must have for other human beings, and this virtue of preference, of ithar, that we saw in 59.9. Through this virtue of ithar, we can look more deeply into the fundamental principles that, from an Islamic perspective, lead God to demand hospitality of human beings. For from an Islamic perspective, God would not enjoin any particular attitudes or actions upon human beings if these actions and attitudes did not correspond to something within our very nature and were not in conformity with, shall we say, the nature of reality as such. Now with ithar, we see that true hospitality, not ostentatious display, so often mistaken for hospitality, is grounded in humility and in the effacement of the ephemeral self. For ithar is to recognize that our human I is not a reality unto itself, and that the human ego is not its own master. The realization of this fundamental reality of the human condition, we can then manifest the two virtues that are necessary for true hospitality: effacement and generosity. Effacement of the ephemeral self, the web of passions, desires, proclivities that we often mistake for our true I, and generosity towards others, because they too have as much right to an I, to an ego, as do we. For in the final analysis, every I, every self, belongs to God and to none other. As the Quran repeatedly states, unto God belongs whatsoever is in the heavens and the earth. From another perspective, only God can truly say, I, and every other I being borrowed from God. Now, so central is the notion of recognizing the right of the other that a famous hadith states, none of you believes until you desire for your brother what you desire for yourself. Now, lest one interpret this as applying to Muslims only, which some have been inclined to do, there's a famous saying of Imam Yahya al-Nawawi, who is regarded by many as one of the greatest scholars of Sunni Islam, and who, I should just make a note, is not always very kind towards non-Muslims in his scholarship. But he nonetheless says, this should first and foremost be understood as universal brotherhood, such that it includes the Muslim and the non-Muslim. So from the perspective here enjoined, recognizing the rights and needs of others alongside the rights and needs of oneself it's not simply a virtue. It is essential for faith to be considered complete. Here we find, in some ways, one of the greatest challenges of hospitality. It is easy enough to open one's house to those to whom one inclines, but to fully open one's heart to others is among the greatest challenges of our human condition. For it demands that we combine effacement and generosity, or humility and charity, or modesty and compassion. One might object that if these are the true requirements of hospitality, then only the saint could truly be hospitable. But as another famous saying of the Prophet Muhammad says, actions are in accord with their intentions, and to each is that which he intends. And part of any virtue, I think we all know this, part of any virtue is the intention to realize it, such that a virtue can be both a condition and a result. In this way, sincere hospitality offered in the humble recognition that on the one hand, we are nothing before God, and that on the other hand, every other human bears the potential for sanctity by definition of being human. This can be the door that opens unto truth itself, unto a greater realization and greater closeness to God. And perhaps this is alluded to in another famous hadith which states, pride is to disregard the truth. And the truth here is going to be a key word, is to disregard the truth and to scorn people. Now, the word, the truth, in this particular hadith is al-haq. And al-haq can also be read as one of the names of God. And in such cases, it means the true or the real. So in other words, the hadith could be phrased, pride is to disregard the real, that is, God, and to scorn people. In this way, the same fault that would lead us to scorn another human being is here presented as the fault that would lead us to disregard God, to turn away from another human being, and to not give him or her his or her proper due, is thus to turn away from God. For in turning away from the other, we fall prey to the constant illusion that our egos are sovereign unto themselves. Now, conversely, there's a positive dimension of this reciprocity between the openness towards God and the openness towards others that is reflected in a very subtle manner in verse 177 of the Quran. The most common translation of this verse states, that you turn your faces to the east and the west is not piety. And here it's an allusion to just performing acts and turning the right way. So this is not piety. Rather, the pious is one who believes in God, the last day, the angels, the book, and the prophets. And despite his love for it, this is the key phrase, and despite his love for it, gives wealth to kin, orphans, the destitute, wayfarers, and those who ask. Now here, this phrase, and despite his love for it, can also be translated, and out of love for him, God. So you have this very subtle placement of one single pronoun. Through this subtle placement, the Quran alludes to the manner in which true piety requires both that one transcend attachments to the things of this world by giving them away, despite their love for them, and that one love God by giving up one's attachment to this world out of love for him. This also touches upon an essential aspect of all virtue, in that the virtue must be carried out with the intention of it being for God, lest our good deeds come to naught, as the Quran says in many verses. And in this way one can see again that hospitality is not simply opening one's house to another, but it is in a way opening one's house to God. Going back to that hadith wherein, it's not a hadith, but wherein a companion of the Prophet, Anas bin Malik, said that one whose house is not entered by guests is not entered by angels. Now, as one can see from the manner in which I have attempted to tease an Islamic understanding of hospitality out of these sources, hospitality is not necessarily a virtue in and of itself. Rather, like love, it is a complex combination of many virtues whose true fulfillment requires us to transcend our ephemeral selves. Moreover, one could say that hospitality is a direct manifestation of the mercy that God has shown us. As a famous saying of the Prophet that is known to all scholars of hadith states, the merciful are shown mercy, that is, the merciful human beings are shown mercy by the merciful, that is God. Be merciful to those on earth, and he who is in heaven will be merciful unto you. Now perhaps this is why the image of the old man from Morocco has resided so deeply within me for all these years. In some way, the hospitality that he felt he had to show me was a small glimmer of the mercy from God, the mercy that God shows to all of us. And in some way, the hospitality that we show to one another is a way in which we make God present in the world, within our homes, and within ourselves. Thank you.
So thank you very much to both Professor Sajdi and Professor Lumbard. We now have, we will take about 20 minutes for questions till about 1:05. So, yes. Did you?
Is there anybody else up first?
No, there wasn't
Okay.
anybody else.
Two quick questions. First to Joseph. Coming back to that wonderful story about the old man who gives you the cup of water, you pay dearly for it, but that great gesture. We've heard about kind of almost the limitless nature of Islamic hospitality and all its richness, but is there not maybe a limit there too? Because would he have been as ecstatically happy to welcome you and give you that gift if he didn't know that you were a Muslim? I mean,
he would have kicked me out of the mosque.
Right. So, in other words, to come back to Dana's point, I mean, is it as a stranger who becomes familiar that he welcomes you, rather than a stranger as a stranger? So that's my question briefly to you. And to Dana, you said at the end of your presentation that one needs to be dead to be welcomed as a stranger into the a manner of speaking.
Maybe
but
not, yeah.
if I could push it a little bit, that example, that topographical example you gave of the city extending its walls to include the buried stranger, who maybe now has become a guest. But in that extension of the walls, and you work a lot on cities, so you know all about this, is that a gesture of inclusivism and assimilation, that suddenly the stranger has become familiar? Or is it a sense in which we've got to recognize that the limits of our city were too narrow, and we've got to extend them towards the otherness of the stranger so that our city changes, rather than that the stranger changes by receiving the status of the citizen and the dweller?
I think for the latter, I think it's kind of goes, I mean, I haven't thought about it this way, but now that you put it this way, it goes without saying that when you assimilate someone, it means that you have to change a part of yourself, and even the physical topography has to change to bring them in.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of, thank you for bringing that in, because that I had not thought about. But what was your first question?
Oh, it was maybe a bit flippant.
The
but
thing about the dead.
Yeah.
You see,
Why aren't they accepted when they're alive?
I mean, they may have been.
Right.
You see, there's no way of telling.
Okay.
However, at least the fact that their signification in the text is a bit odd makes me think maybe they were not, but then maybe they were.
Okay.
And it's actually that's exactly my question. Maybe they were so great that they had to be signified differently. And then as soon as they enter text, we know that people knew them. Right? So, I mean, why would I mention somebody died and put an obituary in my book if I don't think they're important? Because, many people died in Damascus and they're not included in these things, right? So, obviously they have, but they remained, I think, in a tense relationship. And also there's another question here, is the degree of the mysticism, I mean, very simplistically. I mean, because everybody was a mystic at that point in time, and everybody was a part of a Sufi order, but it's the behavior, whether, to what the extremity or not of it is also another question that needs to be teased out in research like that. I mean, is it the antisocial behavior of this guy that made him actually, that familiarized him in the end, and they constructed him after his death in incredible ways in their hagiographies. So he was co-opted in a literary way as well. So I need to think about practices also on the part of those people who come in. And I don't know if we have the sources to do that. Yeah.
So I want to go back to the first question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually something that I thought of and that's actually why when I said that the hospitality, the principle that he manifested for me, because it was at that time. And I actually had several instances of people not believing me after I went through the Muslim test as to whether or not I was actually a Muslim when I was living in Morocco. But in that instant, I mean, it's that point at which shall we say, that I was rendered familiar by the fact of being his brother in Islam, in his perspective, his brother in Islam, that then he wanted to open his heart to me in that particular way, and for me, the reason I use that example is because, for one thing, it's the most vivid example of a transformation for me, and also because it's a very comical example that helps to break the ice. And
also the receipt of the gift.
Yeah.
The receipt, there's the receipt. The receipt of the gift. And that for me, I mean, that was also something that I still have trouble learning when I'm in many parts of the Islamic world, is the degree to which one has to actually accept the invitations, even when the invitations are extremely inconvenient. And there are several other hadith about this that say that that the Prophet would travel, would name different regions outside of Medina, that if he received an invitation that he would go to this particular region. And sometimes by today's standards these are 4 or 5 miles away, which meant that one had to go by 5 miles and horseback and then come back, and so it was rather arduous to do that for dinner. But this is so there's those two aspects to it. There are many other aspects, many other instances I have that I can think of, but I've never had another instance in my life where where I witnessed a person's heart so quickly melt in the desire to manifest hospitality. I've had many situations where people, the circumstances in which they lived, I couldn't believe. I knew that this meal was really putting them out, but they felt that they had to honor me.
Can I? Yeah, go ahead.
You brought up mysticism, and I was wondering if either of you could talk to the possible differences within these traditions of the mystical approach and the non-mystical approach and more popular religions, because mysticism by itself seems to me would lead you to a more open sense of limitlessness, but whether this is actually reflected in popular religions and especially in the more ritual aspects, like within the mosque, non-Muslims shouldn't be there. So, and I know Islam has a very strong mystical tradition, but I'm wondering whether that represents a tension within the Muslim community itself.
It's an excellent question, and actually, my do you want to speak to it, or you're the one who mentioned it?
Actually, but I actually, in a way, as a historian, I would not want to answer your question, because I will tell you that at every moment in time and every space, practice and belief were so different that I can't speak for an Islamic tradition as such, right? So mysticism itself, in the way that I mentioned, the 18th century is very different from the 13th century, is very different from the 15th century. And I always, the way that I teach my students, the way I think about religion or revelation, or these things that we take as the most important text in our, I say that we can't explain anything through them. We can only look at how people at a certain point in time attempt to emphasize one or two aspects of them for practice, or to, and so I'm kind of I find it very difficult for me to speak about mysticism. I will tell you that in the 18th century in Damascus, this is what happened, right? And so and that's why I leave it to you, because you probably know the texts better.
Actually, this idea of ithar, this is something that the Sufi tradition, the mainline mystical tradition in Islam, that they really emphasize. And actually, in a sense, what I was trying to do in my paper is to not even mention this as something that is necessarily part of the mystical tradition, because there's really, within the way that the mystical tradition is usually manifest within Islamic society, there really is a crossover between what we might consider the exoteric and the esoteric. And so this idea, and this is where I was getting to with the notions of the self, and of how really it goes more deeply into giving, into realizing the ephemerality of one's ego. That really is very much a mystical notion, but it is something that I think that one can see the hadith, sayings of the Prophet, and the Quran pointing to and opening to. They open to them to this attitude, but they don't necessarily make it fully incumbent upon everybody. In a sense, recognizing that is a very difficult level of virtue to attain to.
I wonder if I could follow that up briefly. In terms of accomplishing ithar, you alluded to this in your talk with appropriating certain virtues of hospitality, but it strikes me that I'm often struck by my lack of resource for hospitality, my inability to do what I think I should do. So I wonder if in this tradition there's a way of charting out a course that we might gain this sort of resource and achieve this sort of virtue, and maybe you can talk to that.
Oh, wow. Within the Sufi mystical tradition, there are a lot of ways that they say that one can do it. It's an overall the overall methodology. And are you really talking here? I mean, is your question really getting to kind of the spiritual methodology by which one can more fully realize the ephemerality of self and then be able to more fully give preference to others?
Maybe not as much the details of it, but whether or not this is a recognized aspect of the tradition itself. That we recognize, look, this doesn't come easy, and we need to go through these steps in order to achieve this.
Yes, most definitely. It's recognized that this is actually very difficult. To attain to the fullness of it is very difficult.
John?
I had this question while you were talking about the Indian mystic who was buried in the graveyard of the strangers. Can you say something about who made the decision about where that Indian mystic would be buried? I mean, I wondered if the Indian mystic himself had something like a will, if there's some group that decides that, and that would have some bearing on this question of what it means.
I think if we figured that out, I think I don't have a presentation, right? Because that's kind of the big question. Who decides? I mean, can someone decide where they're buried? And I mean, clearly the place where the prayer of the deceased is set upon them is usually their neighborhood, or if they're prominent enough, it's in the Umayyad mosque, the main congregational mosque. So at least that decision is clear to me. But the decision of burial is very difficult for me to explain, and that's why I'm having this whole paper. Is it that they decided that? Is it like Mullah Ilyas who said I'm coming out, or is it that prominent people in the community thought he's not going to be next to this saint or next to this college, he's going to be there, and that's what I'm trying to resolve. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, both of you, about, I think both of you have helped us better understand what is involved in understanding the way a real act of hospitality becomes real, with all, you've introduced, Joseph, this notion of sincerity, that it has to be, the act has to be sincere, it has to be received also in good faith, and this notion of sincerity I thought was very important. At the same time, you've talked about, some of the dangers and also some of the limits of perhaps rejecting hospitality, or the risk involved in accepting it. I wonder if you could talk about the cultural practices that many Muslims share regarding the negotiation process, whereby when you're offered hospitality, there's a whole set of rituals about you offer it, you have to negotiate. Those of us who are familiar with that, have all experienced it. There's a long. People who see this from the outside are very surprised by this. There's a lot of intense argument, almost, right, in negotiating the act of hospitality.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Do you want to?
Go ahead first. Yeah.
Well, I'll begin. There's a famous story about one of the things that one's supposed to do for one's guest is that one is supposed to walk one's guest to the door. No matter how many guests one has, this is part and part of the Islamic tradition. In fact, if you had even like a secular non-practicing person from Iran or some other country were in your house and you didn't walk them to the door, they would be really taken aback by this. And there's a famous story of these two friends that they spent the night. One had dinner at their house, and he walked his friend to the door, and then his friend lived down the street. He said, "Oh, why don't I walk you? Just to your friend." And then they got to his door, and his friend said, "Oh, let me walk you back to your house." and then they kept on doing this back and forth until it was time for the morning prayer. And they went to the mosque and they prayed together, and they went their separate ways.
I just want to add that this was mentioned yesterday.
Oh, it was mentioned yesterday.
Oh.
The Jewish
Judaism.
Oh.
Yes.
See, that's what I get for missing out. No. So there are these complex. Negotiations, and especially when one goes to one's house. It's interesting as a foreigner. One of the problems that I often have is that I have to eat a whole lot more
Yes.
than the other.
Not only do you have to eat it, but you have to actually argue about that, right?
Yes, you have to have the argument.
Right, you
back
have to
and
have
forth.
the argument before you eat.
Yes, you have to have the argument before you eat, and go back and forth.
What's this argument about? Is it about, is it to test the sincerity of the act? I mean, is that what it's about? Is sort of reenacting this notion that what you're trying to figure out, is this genuine? Is this a genuine offer and a genuine acceptance? You know,
there's an aspect of that sometimes that there are aspects where one is obliged to turn down. Not all invitations, but some invitations one is obliged to turn down the invitation. Some say 2, some say 3 times, and then if it's extended a 4th time, then you say then you know that it's that it's sincere. I mean, it's great in Iran. This is the ta'aruf in Iran. I mean, it's this complex web of manners that I although I've lived in Iran, I don't get it. And it's to the point. I mean, I actually started getting sarcastic with it because towards the end of my time and getting frustrated with it because people, like, for example, you go to a restaurant or something and they say qabil nadare, you don't accept anything from you, and it's obligatory to say this, even if you owe them like $150 for the dinner check, it's obligatory for them to say, "Oh no, we don't want your money." So I had fun playing the game of the ignorant foreigner. That I would say, "Oh, okay," no. This is I've never seen. Have you been to Iran, Dana?
I haven't been to Iran, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
This is where it is far more intricate in Iran than any other place that I've seen it.
But if you're talking about contemporary stuff out of our lives, I mean, there is also an intricate thing in Arab culture. Of course, Iranian culture kind of exceeds it. But the whole point is to say, when you're invited, to say, no, I don't want you to be, I don't want you to expend your energy on this or your time or your. So you're supposed to say that, and they're supposed to say, no. My tiredness is the tiredness that you cause is my comfort, right? And so there's a whole, kind of thing that goes on. And the whole point is also, as a guest, not to show your gluttonous, and actually to the point that a friend of mine, her parents would tell her, eat before you go to the dinner invitation, because you don't want to seem like a glutton, okay? So there's this whole ritual, but I have to say that these kind of rituals sometimes become real, especially in immigration, in exile. We are here in the US, right? And I get in a cab, and he's Moroccan. And so he's like, you speak Arabic, and we start, talking, right? We get to the airport, and he's like, I'm not taking any money from you. And I'm, of course you're gonna. And he's like, no, and insists and gets me out. So it's actually the sincerity becomes actually. It seems that here, because we're away from our families and alone, the origin of the whole edifice of the social social game, the origin, we return back to the origin of what brought about this whole thing to start with. So it's a return to the actual transparency of the value when you're away. And so often I get acts of kindness from other people from whom I share a part of my identity by accident that are just completely, and sometimes it's like, Haitians or, people third world or anything that that sees you that you're a foreigner as well, and it's just
But this is actually part of what I was just pointing to with the fact that the virtue is both a process and an end. Is that if one actually learns to do it mechanically, and we all have all these things that we teach our kids to do mechanically, that eventually the sincerity comes about sometimes after many years.
Maybe we can take one last very quick question or comment from Mark.
It's all right.
Okay, good. Well, look, it just remains for me to thank our speakers and to Nida for sharing the session. We now have a lunch break for an hour. We reconvene up in the original room, that is to say 010, which is now being opened. So we'll meet you all there in an hour. We'll talk. 101.